They believed their Panthers were invincible. The Panzerkampfwagen V had crushed Soviet armor on the Eastern Front, demolished American tanks in Normandy, and earned a reputation as the most fearsome medium tank in the world. German panzer crews trusted their machines absolutely. The Panther's sloped armor could deflect most Allied shells. Its long 75mm gun could penetrate enemy tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Every technical specification, every combat report, every engagement seemed to confirm what German tankers already knew in their hearts. They were wrong. The story of how they discovered this begins not with defeat, but with confidence born from 2 years of battlefield dominance. The Panther was no accident of design. It was Germany's answer to a crisis that began on the frozen steppes of Russia in 1941. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June of that year, German panzer divisions rolled east with Panzer III and Panzer IV, tanks that had proven themselves against Polish, French, and British armor. German commanders expected quick victory. What they encountered instead was the Soviet 34, a tank that fundamentally challenged every assumption about armored warfare the Germans had made. The 34 combined 3 characteristics that German tanks could not match simultaneously. It had sloped armor that provided effective protection equivalent to much thicker vertical plate. It had a powerful 76mm gun that could penetrate German armor at combat ranges. And it had wide tracks and a reliable diesel engine that gave it excellent mobility across terrain that stopped German tanks. German tankers watched their armor-piercing rounds bounce off 34 hulls at ranges where Soviet guns could kill them easily. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German tank crews who had spent 2 years believing in their technical superiority suddenly faced an opponent with better equipment. Something had to be done. The German response was characteristically thorough. In November 1941, even before the full extent of the crisis became apparent, Daimler-Benz and MAN received contracts to develop a new medium tank, incorporating lessons from encounters with Soviet armor. The specifications were clear. The new tank would weigh approximately 30 tons, mount a powerful, long-barreled 75mm gun, have sloped armor for maximum protection, and possess the mobility to operate across all terrain types. MAN's design, featuring a hull and turret with extensive sloping, won the contract. Production began in January 1943. The Panther that emerged from German factories was a formidable machine. It measured 8.86 meters long with the gun forward, 3.43 meters wide, and 2.98 meters tall. In American measurements, that was 29 feet long, 11 feet 3 inches wide, and just under 10 feet tall. The combat weight reached 44.8 tons when loaded with crew, fuel, and ammunition. The armor was sophisticated. The front hull was sloped at 55 degrees from vertical and was 80 millimeters thick. This combination meant that an incoming projectile had to penetrate the equivalent of approximately 140 millimeters of vertical armor to defeat it. The turret front was 100 millimeters thick, curved to maximize deflection. Side armor was 50 millimeters on the hull and 45 millimeters on the turret, angled to provide additional protection. Even the roof and floor had sufficient armor to resist most artillery fragments and light anti-tank weapons. Inside the tank was cramped but functional. The crew consisted of 5 men. The driver sat in the front left of the hull, with vision equipment that included periscopes and a direct vision port. The radio operator sat to the driver's right, manning a hull-mounted MG-34 machine gun. The commander occupied the turret, standing in a cupola with vision blocks that provided all-around observation. The gunner sat to the commander's left front, operating the main gun with a sophisticated telescopic sight. The loader stood to the gunner's right, handling ammunition from racks throughout the fighting compartment. The main armament was the KOK 42 75mm gun, one of the finest tank weapons of the war. With a barrel 70 calibers long, it fired armor-piercing rounds at a muzzle velocity exceeding 3,000 feet per second. At 1,000 meters, standard ammunition could penetrate 111 millimeters of vertical armor plate. At 2,000 meters, it could still penetrate 89 millimeters. These were not theoretical numbers. They were verified through extensive testing and confirmed in combat across 2 years of fighting. The power plant was a Maybach HL 230P, 30 gasoline engine producing 690 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. This gave the Panther a power-to-weight ratio of approximately 15 horsepower per ton, excellent for a tank of its size. Maximum road speed was 46 kilometers per hour. Cross-country speed varied with terrain, but averaged 20 to 25 kilometers per hour. The fuel capacity of 720 liters provided a range of approximately 200 kilometers on roads, less in difficult terrain. The Panther first saw combat in July 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. The initial deployment was troubled by mechanical problems. Engines caught fire. Transmissions failed. Final drives broke. German engineers worked frantically to address these issues, and by autumn 1943, the Panther had matured into a reliable combat vehicle. On the Eastern Front, it proved devastating against Soviet armor. Its gun could engage 34s at ranges where Soviet guns were ineffective. Its sloped armor defeated most Soviet anti-tank weapons. Soviet tankers learned to fear the distinctive profile of the Panther. When Panthers began appearing on the Western Front in 1944, they brought this reputation with them. German tank crews who had experienced the Panther's superiority against Soviet armor assumed it would be equally dominant against American and British tanks. The assumption seemed reasonable. American M4 Sherman tanks mounting standard 75mm guns could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. British Cromwell tanks were similarly outmatched. Even the American 76mm gun, when it began appearing in summer 1944, struggled against the Panther's frontal armor with standard ammunition. German propaganda reinforced this technical reality with claims of invincibility. Training materials emphasized the Panther's superiority. Crews were told they had the finest tank in the world. Many believed it absolutely. After all, the numbers seemed to support the claim. In Normandy, during June and July 1944, Panthers destroyed Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. German tankers racked up impressive kill ratios. One Panther could hold off multiple Shermans through superior firepower and protection. But there were warning signs for anyone paying attention. Panthers were mechanically complex, requiring extensive maintenance that German units increasingly could not provide. Fuel consumption was high, and fuel supplies were dwindling as Allied air forces systematically destroyed German logistics. Replacement parts were scarce. Experienced crews were being killed faster than new crews could be trained. Most critically, the industrial situation was deteriorating rapidly. German tank production, while impressive by German standards, could not match Allied output. In 1944, German factories produced approximately 4,000 Panthers. This represented a remarkable achievement, given the constant Allied bombing of industrial targets. But American factories in the same year produced over 11,000 M4 Shermans of all types. The numerical disparity was nearly 3-to-1, and the Americans had additional advantages in logistics, air support, and artillery that multiplied their combat effectiveness. By September 1944, the situation on the Western Front was deteriorating rapidly for Germany. American forces had broken out from Normandy in Operation Cobra, racing across France and liberating Paris. General George S. Patton's Third Army was driving east toward the German border. On September 5th, elements of the 4th Armoured Division captured bridges over the Moselle River near Dieulouard and established a bridgehead on the east bank. For German High Command, this penetration was intolerable. If the Americans consolidated their bridgehead and brought up supplies, nothing would stop them from driving straight into Germany. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, received orders to mount a counter-offensive. The objective was clear: recapture Lunéville, eliminate the American bridgehead at Dieulouard, and throw the Americans back across the Moselle. Manteuffel's force was substantial by September 1944 standards. 3 Panzer brigades provided the armoured punch. The 111th and 113th Panzer brigades were newly formed units, equipped with factory-fresh tanks. The 11th Panzer Division, veteran but under strength, would provide experienced leadership. In total, 5th Panzer Army assembled 262 armoured fighting vehicles. 107 were Panthers, 75 were Panzer IVs, 80 were assault guns and tank destroyers. The Panthers were assigned to the Panzer Brigade's 1st Battalions. Each battalion had approximately 36 Panthers organised into 4 companies. These were OSF-G models, the latest production variant with improved armour and reliability. The crews ranged from veterans transferred from the Eastern Front to fresh recruits straight from training schools. Most had minimal experience working together as units. The Panzer Brigades themselves had been formed only weeks earlier as part of a desperate effort to rebuild German armoured strength. The American force defending the sector was Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, commanded by Colonel Bruce C. Clark. CCA was a combined arms task force built around the 37th Tank Battalion, equipped with M4 Sherman medium tanks. Most mounted the standard 75mm gun. A few had the newer 76mm weapon. Supporting the tanks were tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, mounting 76mm guns in open-topped turrets. The Shermans that would face the Panthers at Arracourt were typical mid-war American tanks. The M4A3 variant weighed approximately 31 tons. It measured 19 feet 4 inches long, 8 feet 7 inches wide, and 9 feet tall. The crew of 5 worked in a fighting compartment that was relatively spacious by tank standards. The commander had a cupola with vision blocks. The gunner had a telescopic sight and power traverse for the turret. The loader had organised ammunition racks. The driver and bow gunner had adequate space and vision equipment. The 75mm M3 gun was the standard armament. It could fire armour-piercing rounds at approximately 2,400 feet per second. Against vertical armour at 1,000 metres, it could penetrate approximately 70 millimetres. This was sufficient to penetrate a Panther's side armour, but inadequate against the frontal armour. The few Shermans mounting 76mm M1 guns had better performance, penetrating approximately 92 millimetres at 1,000 metres, but this was still insufficient against the Panther's frontal armour without hitting weak spots or using special ammunition. On paper, the matchup favoured the Germans dramatically. Panthers outnumbered Shermans in the sector. Panther guns outranged Sherman guns. Panther armour resisted Sherman fire at ranges where Panthers could destroy Shermans easily. German tankers knew these numbers. American tankers knew them too. But numbers on paper do not win battles. Tactics, terrain, intelligence, training, logistics, and coordination matter more than raw specifications. The Americans at Arracourt understood this. The Germans, confident in their technical superiority, did not. The German attack began on September 18th with probing attacks against Lunéville by the 111th Panzer Brigade. American forces, reinforced by elements of both the 4th and 6th Armoured Divisions, beat back the assault. 24 German tanks and assault guns were destroyed in sharp fighting. The German commander, recognizing he could not take Lunéville quickly, bypassed the town and moved north toward Arracourt, where Combat Command A held thinly spread positions. Combat Command A's dispositions around Arracourt consisted of an extended outpost line. Armoured infantry and engineers held forward positions supported by tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery positioned in depth. Colonel Clark had excellent intelligence. His reconnaissance units tracked German movements. Radio intercepts provided warning of attacks. He used this information to position his forces advantageously, accepting risk in some sectors to mass combat power where it mattered most. On the evening of September 18th, reports of increased German activity led Clark to cancel planned offensive operations and prepare for defense. Throughout the night, German tank columns moved into position. Diesel engines and the distinctive sound of tank tracks carried across the autumn landscape. American sentries reported movement to the east and south. Artillery batteries plotted defensive fire missions. Tank destroyer crews checked their weapons and ammunition. Sherman crews conducted final maintenance and positioned their tanks in hull-down positions where terrain masked their hulls, while allowing their guns to engage. At 0800 hours on September 19th, company-sized elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated Combat Command A's outposts on the east and south faces of the American salient. The weather was miserable. Heavy fog blanketed the battlefield, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters in many areas. This fog would prove decisive, negating the Germans' advantage in long-range firepower. Panthers emerged from the fog in columns, advancing blindly toward American positions. The German plan called for aggressive movement to overrun American defenses before they could respond. But 5th Panzer Army had not deployed adequate reconnaissance. German commanders had no detailed knowledge of American positions, defensive preparations, or the terrain they would cross. They were advancing into unknown ground, shrouded by fog, against an enemy who had carefully prepared the battlefield. 2 American tank destroyer platoons and a medium tank company engaged the German armor in a running fight that extended into the vicinity of Combat Command A's headquarters. M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, fast and agile with their powerful 76mm guns, engaged Panthers at close range, using the fog as cover. Sherman tanks positioned on commanding terrain opened fire as German tanks appeared from the murk. The tactical deployment of the German tanks was poor. Panthers advanced in column along roads and trails, their formation dictated by the limited visibility rather than sound tactical principles. As they emerged from tree lines and defiles, they exposed their thinner side armor to American guns positioned in prepared positions. American tank commanders, intimate with the terrain from days of patrolling and reconnaissance, knew exactly where German tanks would appear and positioned their weapons accordingly. At Hill 246, approximately 800 yards from the village of Arracourt-la-Petite, Captain William Dwight established a blocking position with 4 M18 tank destroyers under Lieutenant Edwin Leiper. At 7:45 in the morning, the crews assumed firing positions and immediately saw German tanks emerging from woods at the base of the hill. Panthers and Panzer IVs advanced up the slope, unaware that American guns were trained on them from above. Leiper's tank destroyers opened fire. The 76mm guns barked, recoiling in their mounts. Armor-piercing rounds struck Panthers in the thinner side armor as the German tanks navigated the slope. One Panther burst into flames, another slewed to a halt, its track severed. A third attempted to traverse its turret toward the American position, but was hit again before it could return fire. The remaining German tanks withdrew back into the fog, leaving burning hulks on the hillside. Throughout the morning, similar engagements erupted across the battlefield. Panthers probed American positions, found themselves under fire from prepared positions, and withdrew with losses. American artillery, directed by forward observers with excellent fields of view from commanding terrain, dropped concentrations on German formations. M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers engaged German tanks with direct fire when Panthers approached too close to Combat Command A's headquarters positions. The Germans had no answer to this combination of prepared defenses, superior intelligence, and coordinated fires. Their longer-range guns were useless in the fog. Their heavier armor provided no advantage when American guns engaged them from the flank at close range. Their numerical superiority meant nothing when they could not coordinate their attacks or concentrate their forces effectively. One engagement captured the essence of the entire battle. When Panthers turned away after an aborted attack at the town of Lazy, Captain James Lamison took 4 Sherman tanks from C Company and raced the enemy some 3,000 yards to a commanding ridge west of Bézange-la-Petite. The superior mobility of the American tanks allowed them to traverse the distance in minutes. Arriving on the ridge about 3 minutes before 8 Panthers appeared below, Lamison's tanks got set in hull-down positions. The Panthers, moving in column through a valley, were completely unaware of the American tanks above them. Lamison's gunners aimed carefully, each selecting a target. At his command, all 4 Shermans fired simultaneously. 4 Panthers were hit before they could return fire. The remaining Panthers attempted to maneuver, searching desperately for their attackers in the fog. Lamesson's tanks withdrew over the crest of the ridge, moved south a short distance, reappeared at a different position, and finished off the remaining Panthers with flank shots at close range. This pattern repeated throughout September 19th. American tanks and tank destroyers used mobility and terrain knowledge to engage German armor from advantageous positions. When Panthers attempted to use their superior frontal armor, American crews maneuvered to attack from the side or rear. When German tanks exposed themselves crossing open ground, American guns fired from concealed positions. The fog that should have been a neutral factor instead favored the Americans who knew the ground intimately. By mid-afternoon, the German attack had stalled completely. Approximately 43 enemy tanks, mostly Panthers, had been destroyed. American losses were minimal. 3 tank destroyers and 5 Sherman tanks had been knocked out. 6 American soldiers were killed and 13 wounded. The disparity was stunning. The supposedly invincible Panthers had been systematically destroyed by an American force using inferior equipment through superior tactics. German tank crews who survived were stunned. They had believed their Panthers made them nearly untouchable. The technical specifications said their frontal armor was immune to American 75mm guns. The training manuals emphasized their superiority. Combat experience on the Eastern Front had reinforced these beliefs. Yet, here, in the fog of Lorraine, their Panthers burned just as easily as any other tank when hit in the side armor at close range. One German tank commander, captured after his Panther was disabled, told American interrogators that he had never imagined American tanks could maneuver so aggressively. He had expected the Americans to defend passively, allowing German tanks to engage at long range where Panther guns were superior. Instead, American tanks moved constantly, using terrain and fog to close the range and attack from unexpected directions. His crew had been trained to fight one kind of battle. The Americans fought a completely different one. The psychological impact was profound. For German tankers who had trusted absolutely in their equipment's superiority, the revelation that tactics and terrain could neutralize technical advantages was devastating. The Panther was still a formidable tank. Its gun could still kill at long range. Its frontal armor could still resist most Allied guns. But these advantages meant nothing when American tanks refused to fight on German terms. For American tank crews, the battle provided a different lesson. They had spent months hearing about the fearsome Panther, reading intelligence reports about its capabilities, and worrying about how to defeat it. At Arracourt, they learned that aggressive tactics, superior intelligence, and proper use of terrain could overcome technical inferiority. The 75mm gun might not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor, but it worked fine against side armor at close range. And American tanks were faster, more reliable, and supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. The battle continued over the following days with similar results. On September 20th, German forces launched another major attack. Once again, American defenders used prepared positions and terrain knowledge to defeat tanks advancing blindly across unfamiliar ground. German losses mounted. More Panthers burned. More crews died or were captured. The supposedly elite Panzer brigades were being systematically destroyed by a smaller American force. On September 29th, the weather finally cleared. XIX Tactical Air Command immediately brought its full weight to bear on German formations. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, equipped with bombs and rockets, attacked German tank columns wherever they appeared. One pilot, Major Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, became famous for attacking Panthers with bazooka rockets fired from his Piper L-4 Cub observation aircraft. In multiple sorties, Carpenter destroyed several German tanks, proving that even light aircraft could threaten armor when tactical air superiority was absolute. By the time the battle ended, German forces had lost approximately 200 tanks and assault guns from their initial force of 262. The two Panzer brigades, formed only weeks earlier with new equipment and crews, were effectively destroyed as cohesive fighting units. Combat Command A had lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The kill ratio was approximately 8-1 in favor of the Americans. The strategic consequences were significant. The German counteroffensive had failed completely. American forces retained their bridgehead over the Moselle. Third Army could continue its advance toward Germany. The carefully hoarded reserves that German High Command had committed to the counteroffensive were gone, destroyed in 11 days of fighting. More importantly, the myth of Panther invincibility had been shattered. For German tank crews across the Western Front, news of Arracourt spread quickly through military channels. Panzer units on other sectors heard what had happened. They learned that Panthers had been destroyed by supposedly inferior American tanks through superior tactics and combined arms coordination. The psychological impact was severe. Crews who had trusted their Panthers absolutely now understood their equipment could not compensate for poor tactics, inadequate reconnaissance, and lack of combined arms support. The industrial reality made the situation even worse. Germany simply could not replace the losses at Arracourt quickly. The Panthers destroyed in Lorraine had taken months to build. The trained crews killed or captured would take even longer to replace. Meanwhile, American factories continued, producing Sherman tanks at rates German industry could not match. Every week, hundreds of new Shermans arrived in Europe, along with fresh crews trained to competence. The Americans could afford losses. The Germans could not. German engineers understood the problem. They designed improved tanks like the Panther II and the E-series prototypes, with better armor, better guns, and better mechanical reliability. But these designs required time and resources Germany no longer had. The strategic bombing campaign was systematically destroying German industry. Raw materials were increasingly scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted into the Wehrmacht to replace casualties. The quality of German tank production was declining, even as Allied tank production improved. American tankers, meanwhile, were learning lessons that would serve them through the rest of the war. The Sherman might be outgunned by German tanks in technical specifications, but the Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in overwhelming numbers. Combined with superior tactics, excellent logistics, and overwhelming air support, the Sherman was more than adequate. By late 1944, improved versions were appearing. The M4A3E8, known as the Easy 8, had wider tracks, better suspension, and the 76mm gun as standard. These tanks were even more capable than the vehicles that had fought at Arracourt. The Americans also received improved ammunition. HVAP rounds, using tungsten penetrators, could defeat Panther frontal armor at normal combat ranges when fired from 76mm guns. Supply was limited because tungsten was a critical war material needed for many applications, but when HVAP rounds were available, American tank crews could engage Panthers frontally with confidence. The technical gap was closing even as German industrial capacity declined. After the war, when historians and armor experts analyzed the Battle of Arracourt, several lessons emerged, clearly. First, technical superiority in individual weapons systems does not guarantee tactical or strategic success. The Panther was superior to the Sherman in armor protection and gun performance, but the Americans won decisively through superior tactics, better intelligence, more effective combined arms coordination, and overwhelming logistics and air support. Second, crew training and unit cohesion matter enormously in armored warfare. American tank crews at Arracourt had trained together for months. They knew their vehicles intimately. They understood how to work with infantry, artillery, and air support. German Panzer brigade crews, thrown together weeks before the battle with minimal training, could not match this cohesion. Technical superiority could not compensate for inadequate training. Third, industrial capacity ultimately determines the outcome of modern wars between peer adversaries. Germany produced excellent tanks, but German industry could not produce them in sufficient numbers, while also producing aircraft, submarines, artillery, trucks, and all the other materiel required for total war. American industry produced adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers, while also producing everything else needed to fight globally. The numerical disparity made tactical losses sustainable for the Americans and catastrophic for the Germans. The German tankers who climbed into their Panthers in September 1944 believed they had the best tank in the world. They were not entirely wrong. The Panther was an excellent tank by the technical standards of 1944, but excellence in engineering could not overcome strategic mistakes, tactical errors, and overwhelming material disadvantage. By the time the fog lifted over Arracourt on September 29th, German survivors understood a truth that would only become clearer as the war continued. They had been sent to fight with equipment that was technically superior but strategically inadequate. The Panther could win individual tank duels, but wars are not won by individual duels. They are won by industrial capacity, logistics, air power, artillery, intelligence, and the ability to coordinate all these elements effectively. In every one of these categories, the Americans had overwhelming advantages that no amount of armor, thickness, or gun velocity could overcome. The Panthers destroyed at Arracourt represented more than just tactical losses. They represented the fundamental impossibility of Germany's strategic situation in late 1944. No matter how good German tanks were, they could not change the fact that Germany was fighting the world's greatest industrial powers simultaneously on multiple fronts, with declining resources and mounting casualties. The outcome was never in doubt, only the timeline remained uncertain. For American tank crews who fought at Arracourt, the lesson was simpler and more immediate. They learned that aggressive tactics, proper use of terrain could defeat technically superior opponents. They learned that their Shermans, properly employed, were adequate for the job. They learned that combined arms coordination, with tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power working together, was more effective than any single weapon system. Most importantly, they learned that German tanks, even Panthers, were not invincible. They burned just like any other tank when hit in the right place. This knowledge spread through American armored units across Europe. Tankers who had feared the Panther's reputation learned from Arracourt that aggression and maneuver could overcome technical disadvantages. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, American tank crews faced Panthers and Tiger IIs in winter conditions. They fought more cautiously than at Arracourt, but without the paralyzing fear that German armor might have inspired months earlier. The Sherman tankers knew they could win. They had done it before. They would do it again. The Battle of Arracourt was not the largest tank battle of the war. It was not the most strategically significant engagement, but it was a perfect crystallization of the realities of armored warfare in 1944. Technical superiority matters, but training, tactics, intelligence, coordination, logistics, and industrial capacity matter more. The Germans had better individual tanks. The Americans had everything else. The specific training German Panther crews received in autumn 1944 reveals much about why they failed so catastrophically at Arracourt. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were formed in August and September 1944 as part of a desperate program to rebuild German armoured strength after devastating losses in Normandy and on the Eastern Front. The training cycle for these units was compressed to an extraordinary degree. Crews received approximately 4 to 6 weeks of instruction compared to the 4 to 6 months considered minimum for effective armoured unit training. At Grafenwöhr training area in Bavaria, new Panther crews learned basic vehicle operation. Drivers practiced starting the complex Maybach engine, managing the 7-speed transmission, and steering the 44-ton vehicle through obstacle courses. Loaders drilled on ammunition handling, learning to distinguish between armor-piercing, high-explosive, and smoke rounds in the dim light of the fighting compartment. Gunners trained on the Turmziel-Fernrohr 9 optic sight, practicing range estimation and lead calculation for moving targets. Commanders studied map reading, radio procedures, and the coordination of crew actions. But what they did not receive was adequate tactical training in combined arms operations. The curriculum emphasized individual tank skills and small unit tactics. Company-level exercises were limited. Battalion-level maneuvers were almost non-existent. Coordination with infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance units received minimal attention. Most critically, crews had little experience working together as cohesive teams. A Panther crew in combat functions as a single organism. Each man must anticipate the other's actions. The commander must understand his gunner's capabilities. The loader must know exactly where each ammunition type is stored. The driver must respond instantly to commands. This level of coordination requires months of training together. The Panzer Brigade crews had weeks. The ideological indoctrination accompanying technical training was equally problematic. Political officers emphasized the Panthers' technical superiority relentlessly. Crews were told their armor was impenetrable to American guns at normal combat ranges. They learned that American tankers were poorly trained, lacking the fighting spirit of German soldiers. They heard that American Shermans were inferior machines, produced by a materialistic society that valued quantity over quality. One training document from this period, preserved in German military archives, stated explicitly that one Panther was worth 5 Shermans in combat effectiveness. This propaganda served a purpose. It maintained morale among crews who would soon face combat against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. But it also created dangerous assumptions. Panther crews expected to dominate the battlefield through sheer technical superiority. They anticipated that American tanks would fight defensively, avoiding close combat where German guns held advantage. They believed their armor would protect them from most threats, allowing aggressive maneuver and bold attacks. None of these assumptions would survive contact with reality at Arracourt. The American tank crews opposing them came from a completely different training system. The 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division had trained together since early 1942. The unit formed at Pine Camp, New York, equipped initially with M3 light tanks and M3 Grant medium tanks. Over 18 months of stateside training, crews progressed through individual skills, platoon exercises, company maneuvers, and battalion-level operations. They practiced gunnery until loading and firing became automatic. They conducted maintenance until every crew member could diagnose and repair common mechanical problems. They trained in coordination with infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support until combined arms operations became instinctive. In September 1943, the battalion deployed to England for final preparations before combat. Additional training focused on European terrain, weather conditions, and German tactics. Crews studied intelligence reports on German armor. They learned the silhouettes of Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs. They memorized the weak points in German armor: the lower hull, the turret ring, the side plates, the engine deck. They practiced engaging moving targets at various ranges. They rehearsed ammunition selection, learning when to use armor-piercing rounds versus high-explosive shells. By the time the 4th Armored Division landed in France in July 1944, the 37th Tank Battalion was a thoroughly professional unit. Crews had logged hundreds of hours in their tanks. They knew their Shermans intimately, understanding both capabilities and limitations. They had trained in coordination with the supporting arms that would accompany them in combat. Most importantly, they had developed the unit cohesion that allows experienced crews to fight effectively under stress. The disparity in experience between German and American crews at Arracourt was profound. American tank commanders averaged 18 to 24 months of training and several months of combat experience. German Panzer Brigade commanders had 6 weeks of training and no combat experience in their current units. American crews knew their vehicles could be penetrated by German guns. They compensated through tactics, using terrain and maneuver to minimize exposure. German crews believed their armor made them nearly invulnerable. This false confidence led to tactical carelessness that proved fatal. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The material evidence of American industrial superiority was visible everywhere around Arracourt, had German commanders chosen to look for it. American supply dumps near the Moselle bridgehead contained thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and spare parts. Replacement tanks arrived on tank transporters within days of losses. Damaged Shermans were recovered by specialized maintenance units, repaired, and returned to combat. Artillery ammunition was so abundant that American batteries could fire concentrations at any time without concerning themselves with conservation. The entire American logistical system operated with a casualness that would have been impossible for German forces. The industrial numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In September 1944, American factories produced approximately 1,000 Sherman tanks. German factories in the same month produced approximately 300 Panthers, plus additional Panzer IVs and assault guns. The ratio was more than 3-to-1 in American favor. And this understates the disparity because American production included not just tanks but the entire logistical infrastructure required to maintain them in combat. For every Sherman produced, American industry manufactured the spare parts, the ammunition, the fuel trucks, the recovery vehicles, the maintenance equipment, and the trained crews needed to keep it fighting. German industry in late 1944 was collapsing under the combined weight of strategic bombing, raw material shortages, and labor scarcity. The synthetic fuel plants that provided gasoline for tank engines were priority targets for American heavy bombers. By autumn, fuel production had dropped to approximately 30% of peak capacity. This meant that even when new Panthers rolled off assembly lines, they often sat in factory yards for weeks, awaiting fuel for delivery to units. Crews trained on tanks that never reached the front because there was insufficient fuel to transport them. The quality of German production was also declining. Skilled workers had been drafted into combat units to replace casualties. Their replacements in factories were often foreign laborers working under coercion with no investment in quality. Subcomponents manufactured by subcontractors showed increasing defect rates. Panthers produced in late 1944 were less reliable than those built a year earlier, even as American Shermans were becoming more reliable through continuous manufacturing improvements. The industrial death spiral was well underway, visible to anyone examining production statistics, but invisible to tank crews told their equipment was superior. The moment when German confidence collided with material reality came in the fog of September 19, 1944. For Oberleutnant Hans Frenkel, commander of a Panther from the 113th Panzer Brigade, the morning began with absolute confidence. His crew had performed well during the brief training period. His tank was new, with only 70 kilometers on the odometer. The fog would allow his unit to close with American positions before long-range engagement. Everything seemed to favor German success. Frenkel's company advanced in column along a farm track east of Arracourt, moving slowly through the dense fog. Visibility was perhaps 50 meters. His driver navigated by following the tank ahead, visible only as a dark shadow in the murk. Radio discipline was poor. Multiple commanders spoke simultaneously on the company frequency, creating confusion about positions and objectives. The column emerged from a tree line into open ground without reconnaissance, without infantry support, without knowledge of what lay ahead. The first indication of trouble was the sharp crack of a 76mm gun firing from elevated ground to the left. The round struck the third tank in column, penetrating the side armor below the turret ring. The Panther slewed to a stop, smoke pouring from hatches. Before Frenkel could react, a second gun fired from a different position. Another Panther was hit, this time in the engine compartment. The diesel engine erupted in flames. Crew members bailed out, running blindly into the fog. A third gun engaged from yet another position. The column was in a kill zone, taking fire from multiple directions with no clear targets for return fire. Frenkel ordered his driver to reverse, trying to extract his tank from the ambush. As the Panther backed toward the tree line, he scanned desperately for targets through his cupola vision blocks. Movement to the right caught his attention. A Sherman emerged from the fog at perhaps 100 meters, its 75mm gun traversing toward him. Frenkel shouted for his gunner to engage. The turret began traversing with agonizing slowness. Hand-cranked turret traverse, adequate for engaging targets at long range, was far too slow for this close-range encounter. The Sherman fired first. The 75mm armor-piercing round struck Frenkel's Panther in the side armor at the junction of hull and turret. The round penetrated cleanly, entered the fighting compartment, and detonated the stored ammunition. The explosion blew the turret completely off the hull. Frenkel, standing in the cupola, was thrown clear by the blast. He landed heavily in muddy ground, stunned but alive. His crew was dead, killed instantly by the ammunition explosion. As Frenkel lay in the mud, dazed and injured, he watched American tanks maneuver through the fog with practiced efficiency. They moved in pairs, one providing overwatch while the other advanced. They used terrain features for cover, appearing briefly to fire before withdrawing to new positions. They coordinated their movements through radio communications, speaking in calm English voices that carried through the morning air. These were not the poorly trained, defensive-minded tankers German propaganda had described. These were professionals, executing complex tactics with precision. The psychological impact of this moment would stay with Frenkel for the rest of his life. In interviews conducted decades after the war, he described September 19, 1944, as the day he understood Germany would lose. Not because of one ambush, not because of one destroyed tank, but because of what the ambush revealed about the fundamental imbalance between the two sides. American tanks moved with confidence, born from training and experience. American crews coordinated through universal radio equipment. American tactics exploited terrain and visibility conditions expertly. Most damning of all, American forces treated the engagement as routine, just another tactical problem to be solved with standard procedures. The technical superiority of the Panther meant nothing in that context. Frenkel's tank had been destroyed by a supposedly inferior Sherman firing a supposedly inadequate 75mm gun. But the Sherman crew had positioned their tank perfectly, attacked from an unexpected direction, and fired first into vulnerable side armor. All the armor, thickness, and gun velocity in the world could not compensate for being outmaneuvered and outfought. The realization was devastating, because it meant everything Frenkel had been told about German superiority was wrong. The training, the propaganda, the confident assurances from officers, all of it had been built on assumptions that collapsed under the first serious test. For other German tank commanders experiencing similar ambushes across the battlefield that morning, the revelation was identical. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Decker, commanding a Panther from the 111th Panzer Brigade, watched his entire platoon destroyed in less than 10 minutes by American tank destroyers firing from concealed positions on Hill 246. Oberfeldwebel Werner Roth saw his company commander's tank explode when a Sherman fired into its rear armor from ambush. Across the fog-shrouded battlefield, German Panther crews discovered that their supposedly invincible tanks were burning just as easily as any other vehicle when engaged by a competent enemy employing proper tactics. The afternoon brought no relief. As additional German units committed to the attack, American defenders repeated the same pattern. Prepared positions, coordinated fires, aggressive maneuver, and overwhelming artillery support destroyed German tanks faster than they could advance. By nightfall, the 113th Panzer Brigade had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. More than half its Panthers were destroyed or disabled. Its infantry was scattered. Its commanders were dead or captured. The supposedly elite unit, formed with new equipment and told it would sweep aside American resistance, had been annihilated in a single day. The evidence confronting German survivors was undeniable. Their Panthers, despite technical superiority, had been decisively defeated. Their tactics, based on assumptions of dominance, had failed catastrophically. Their intelligence about American capabilities had been completely wrong. The Americans were not poorly trained. Their equipment was not inadequate. Their fighting spirit was not inferior. Every assumption underlying German confidence had been proven false through the most convincing evidence possible. Burning Panthers, littering the battlefield around Arracourt. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.